Okay, thank you very much for coming, and to at least two people, Gillian and Jennifer, I hope that you're able to hear us properly. If you feel free to email me if there's any issues, but I hope it's working. So thank you very much, Joerg, coming all the way from Germany to give a seminar here. And we have two seminars, so we should keep the time. And so first up, Joerg is giving a talk on generating synthetic geocoding information with public records.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. I see a lot of familiar faces here. It's just nice, and I'm happy to be here. Of course, I'm happy that I finally can join in the program, which didn't really work out for the summer, but at least for the last few weeks I can contribute a little bit, which is nice. What I want to talk about is actually a project that I started a while ago. We actually mostly worked on that together with Monica. She's a former PhD student of Jerry Reiter. And she visited us at the IAB last summer, so summer 2015, and we were looking into ways to synthesize geocoding information in our IAB data. So what's the background? More and more agencies now collect detailed geocoding information, which can be useful for a lot of things. Mostly on one hand, it would allow for very detailed analysis where the users really can define their own geographical levels they're interested in. They don't need to use the predefined levels that would often be provided, usually with scientific or public use files. They are usually aggregated to quite a high level, so if users would be interested in different geographical areas, they would have a hard time getting the information they need. And the other main reason or area where geocoding could be really useful is to link information from other sources. So if you have very detailed geocodes available in two files, it's a very useful linkage key then. But I'll mostly focus on the first application here. At least our application was thinking of users that want to define their own level of geographical detail in their analysis. The problem, of course, is that sharing detailed geocoding information is really problematic. Just not so much because the geocodes themselves are any sensitive information usually, but it's very easy to identify individuals, especially if you really have it. So we have it on the exact meter level, the geocodes, and on that level, basically at the IAB, the idea is these geocodes are really treated like addresses. So it's even if you're working with the data at the IAB, you have to make special requests, and usually you still don't get it on that detailed level. You would still need it to be aggregated to, say, 10 meter, or I don't even know what the level now is. I think it's 100 or even 1,000 square meter grids that you get, but only within the IAB. So outside researchers, they can never get those geocodes so far. And I mean, that's common practice, I think. It's hardly ever the case that these detailed geocodes are ever released. And so the question is, what can we do to provide some access? And our motivating example here, as I said, is we try to think of a way to provide access to some data that we have at the IAB. So IAB, for those two that don't know me, would be the Institute for Employment Research in Germany, where I work. And at the IAB, we have a very large database that's constructed from administrative data from the Federal Employment Agency, where we basically have all information from different sources about people that ever are in contact with the BA. So BA is the Federal Employment Agency. So on the one side, we have information on their employment spells. We also have information when they participate in any training programs, when they are looking for jobs, when they receive benefits from the government. And all these different data sources are put together, so we have really very detailed job histories of basically all individuals in Germany. So it's a very rich data source. And to that data source, detailed geocoding information has been added a couple of years ago. And the data for that were provided by the Federal Agency for Cartography and Geodesy, I guess. And it contains about 22 million addresses of German buildings and their corresponding geographic coordinates. And this information was used, just like I said, a record linkage application where you can use these very detailed geocoding information to link the data to our data. So we used the addresses and did some exact matching there, and it seemed that this was actually pretty successful. So 95% of the roughly 40 million individuals in our data and 93% of the 2.5 million establishments in our data were linked successfully. And so now we have all that very detailed information, and the question is there a way that we can provide access to the data for guest researchers? We have a big research data center at the IED that's quite popular, and people, of course, would be interested in using these geocodes, but the question is how can we provide that information? And I think it's obvious that traditional SDC methods, just like doing a little bit of swapping or noise addition, would not sufficiently protect the data. I mean, or either you would protect the data, but then you cannot really use the data in a sensible way anymore, or you don't protect the data and you just can't provide access. So that's why we thought maybe synthetic data might be the alternative here. And this is a slide that I can probably skip. Just the idea of synthetic data, just like multiple imputation, you replace, instead of replacing missing values, you replace sensitive values. Otherwise, it's just basically the same idea. And we, in our application, or the synthesizers that we use, the models that we use to synthesize the data, we focused on two models, DPM-PM, that's a Dirichlet process, mixture of products, multinomials, and card models. And both of them recently were shown to be quite promising in the way they perform for synthetic data, and so we just wanted to see whether those models could be useful. And a little background on those two approaches. The DPM-PM is basically just a Bayesian version of a latent class model for unordered categorical data. It was proposed by Danson and Xing in a JASA paper in 2009, and C and Reiter adopted that approach to impute missing values. The major difference is that they only assume a finite number of mixture components, whereas the original paper had an infinite number. It just makes the modeling much faster. And usually you can monitor your Gibbs sampler to see whether you picked a finite number that's large enough. So in general, that is not really a big issue. I have more details on the model. I don't think we need really to go through that step by step. If there are any questions on that, we can probably come back to the slides. The most important thing basically is that the assumption is that within any class, each of the p variables that are included or that are synthesized or generally included in the model are independently follow a class-specific multinomial distribution, which of course then makes everything a lot easier, because if they are independent, you just have this product of multinomials. That's where the name comes from. So, and that's basically the final model. Then you can model your y, I, k, so I is the individual, k is the kth variable, given the class assignment and a couple of prior parameters phi based on a multinomial model. And then you can also model the class assignment. That's my eta I, so which class is assigned to individual I. That's also follows a multinomial model. And then you have a couple of priors that need to be specified. And again, the most important or the main message is just we use, as always, vague priors here because you don't want to make any informative assumptions about the data if you want to make sure that users can analyze the data the way they think is most reasonable, and you don't want to put any information in your synthesizer usually. So now if we want to synthesize just one variable, say yp, we can do that in 3 steps. First, we need to sample values from the posterior predictive distributions of the different priors that we defined previously. And once we have that, we just need to sample from these 2 multinomial distributions that we had on the slide before. And these 2 extra steps are actually pretty convenient to implement. So there's been a block Gibbs sampler proposed by Ishvaran and James for implementing these kind of DPMPM models, and you only need to extend that Gibbs sampler by the last 2 steps. So there's not much that is additionally required compared to if you just generally want to fit those models. And the good thing is, if you want to synthesize more than one variable, that's pretty easy because, as I said previously, conditional on the class assignment, the variables are independent, so you just need to independently draw from these multinomial models given the class assignment. So that's the DPMPM synthesizer. And card models, if you're not that familiar with card classification and regression trees, a flexible tool for estimating the conditional distribution of a univariate outcome given multivariate predictors. And the basic idea is that you always partition your predictor space to form subsets with homogeneous outcomes. So you always try to split the data in such a way that the 2 nodes that you get for your dependent variable, within the node there's more, or the maximum possible homogeneity compared to what you had when you started with the full data, basically. So these partitions are found by recursive binary splits of the predictors, and these successive splits would build this tree structure. And just to visualize that, if you have your dependent variable and you start, is there a pointer somewhere? No. Okay, so you start in the root. That's where you start with your full data, and you have your dependent variable, and then you try each of the other variables and see, when I split my data on that variable and on that category of that variable, say if you have categorical variables, what would happen to my dependent data? What will be the homogeneity in these 2 leaves that I get there? And I would try that with all my different variables that I have in the data and pick the one that would ensure that my 2 leaves are as homogeneous as possible. So that would be the first step. Once I did that, I would just start over the whole thing again. So within the leaf, again, try all possible splits based on the other variables. Pick the one that makes sure that within the 2 leaves here, the homogeneity is as good as possible. So that's the basic idea of card models. And how do we use that for synthesizer? We grow our tree with the original data, so just fit the card model to the original data. We need to define the minimum number of records in each leaf. Usually that's set to 5 or 10, usually a small number. You could prune the tree if necessary, so just snip off certain branches of the tree to go up a level. If you think you went too far, you're too detailed and are at risk of overfitting. But generally, we found with synthetic data that this is usually not not a good idea because you might lose important information, so important relationships that you just cut off, because whenever you cut off a leaf, you basically say, given these other splits that I had, this final split, so there's no relationship anymore between my dependent variable and the variable that I used for the split, so usually you don't really want that. But anyway, once you have that final tree that you want to use, then you can generate new synthetic data by sending down your partially synthesized data, the tree. So if you already synthesized other variables, your data might look a little different, but you just send it down the tree and see in which leaf each record ends. And then you just draw new values, synthetic values, within that leaf. So within those outcome values that you had in your original tree, you draw new synthetic values based on the probability or the relative frequency of the different outcomes in that leaf. And if you want to synthesize continuous variables, you might use a kernel density estimator for those leaves, just because you want to avoid that exact values, the exact values that you had in the original data are replicated the same way in your synthetic data. But otherwise, the idea is pretty much the same. Okay. Just one note on related approaches in terms of synthesizing the data. There have been a couple of papers that talked about synthesizing detailed geocoding information. Probably the most well-known is the first one by Vachala, I guess. I really never know how to pronounce his name, but the paper is on the map. So it describes the method that they used behind on the map. So on the map, if you don't know that, that's an application at the Census Bureau where you can graphically visualize commuting patterns, so where people travel to work. And for that data, they synthesized, I don't know, it's whether it was the place of work or the place of residence, at least only one of those two they synthesized. And they simply used multinomial models, basically. They did a few extra steps because they wanted to ensure epsilon delta differential privacy, but basically it's just a multinomial model, and that is possible in that application because they don't need to account for any covariate relationship. It's really only about commuting patterns. So you can still use a multinomial model and might get away with that. But if you have more variables to model, just using a multinomial model, that might be just too sparse. Your data might be too sparse. And basically the DPNPM is an extension of that multinomial model. So in that sense, the DPNPM is already an improvement over that. And there's another paper by Wang and Reiter where they suggested using continuous card synthesizers, and we also use continuous card synthesizers, but we also look at a couple of other synthesizers so we can compare them. There's a paper by Sakshok and Raghunathan where they suggest multi-level models, which is not really useful in our case because they only want to synthesize other variables like continuous variables on a detailed level, on the detailed geographical level, but not the geocodes themselves, which would be really hard to model using a multi-level model. Then we have a paper by Paiva et al., where they propose using disease mapping models to synthesize geographical information. That's basically just a Poisson model, and that only works if your geographical information is not too detailed. So you still need a couple of observations in each of those grids that you define, otherwise it doesn't really make sense to use a Poisson model. So that wasn't really helpful for us. And then there's an interesting paper by Quick et al., and they used marked point process modeling to specifically preserve spatial dependencies. And that actually is a really interesting model that will be interesting to be compared to the methods that we look at, because I would say it's really sophisticated. At least it looks sophisticated. It's very complicated. The only problem is it's so complicated. Also, the runtime really, I mean, it's exploding, and they have a very, very small data set, and they already report that it really takes forever, basically, and there's no way you can apply that model to those millions of records that we are looking at. So in that sense, it's not really an option, although it would be interesting to see whether there would be any improvement by using these complex models, but not for such a big data set. So, just having said that, finally the application, we basically said, okay, we start with a selection of variables. So it's not the full EAB, it's only a selection. We use the exact geocoding information, which I said is on exact meters. We have sex, we have foreign, we have age in 6 categories, education, 6 categories. There are different definitions of occupation in the data. The industry of the employer, we have 10 wage categories, and distance to work, and 5 categories. And finally, the zip code, which is not really used in the synthesis, but that's what we looked at the analysis level later on. And we only limit the application to Bavaria for now, which is still 4 million records. I don't think it would make a big difference running it on the full data, just longer runtime. And what we did is we started by synthesizing only the geocodes, and then we evaluate 2 strategies if the level of protection that you get from the synthesis is not considered sufficient. One would be what I would consider the traditional STC approach, which is aggregate the geocodes and do the synthesis afterwards. Because I mean, that's the typical approach. Whenever you release data, you usually, first step is always get rid of the detailed geographical information. If it's on the county level, you go to the state level maybe or something. So usually you just aggregate the geographical information in your data. And so that would be one approach. And we would say, first aggregate the geocodes and then do the synthesis afterwards. And the second approach is just synthesize additional variables, which of course also seems a reasonable way to handle the risks. We look at 2 different versions of the card models. In one version, we treat the geocodes as categorical, so which means, of course, you have a lot of categories, because each geocode is its own category. And the other approach is basically the one that Wang and the writer originally proposed, which is to treat the geocodes as continuous and synthesize longitude and latitude separately. So start with synthesizing one and then synthesize the other one conditional on the first stage synthesis. We divide the data into clusters of size 15,000, just for computational reasons, which admittedly will increase the risk in some sense if an intruder would know that the model has been applied only within these 15,000 records. Obviously, the data points can only change between those 15,000. So there's some risk increase instead in that, but I mean, at least the DPMPM, there's no way you could fit that one big model to 4 million records. It would. Okay? We generate 5 synthetic data sets. For the utility evaluations, it's always this issue that we also discussed at the workshop a couple of weeks ago, that ideally you would want to have this one measure thing that tells you, your data is good or your data is not good, which of course is difficult in practice because those global measures are just too broad, and you might miss some important differences in specific analysis some users might be interested in. And also it's very hard to interpret the numbers that you actually get by these measures like the Kullback-Leibert distance. It's not really clear at which point you would say the data is acceptable, so you can only use that to compare different synthesizers, basically. And the other measures will be outcome-specific measures, and again, here we would have the opposite problem. We only know for that specific analysis that our synthesizer is good. We don't know if it's good in general. So what we try to do is compromise, basically look at both to some extent. And what we did for the utility specific, so the outcome specific measures, we just looked at maps for certain analysis of interest. Here that will be the share of high-wage earners in Bavaria by zip code level. So we assume the intruder is interested in the zip code level. There's no specific reason behind that, just it's easy to generate those maps if you use the zip code, because the grids are easily available in the software already. So it's just easy to produce the maps. That's why we use the zip code level. And what we have here is the original data, the PMPM, card categorical, card continuous. And there are a few things. Obviously, you can, I mean, if you would be familiar with Bavaria, you would easily, now I'm still trying to get the pointer here. Ah, yeah. You could easily identify, so that's the Nuremberg area, that's the Munich area. Here we're getting close to Frankfurt. This is Regensburg. So you can easily identify those areas where there would be more high wage earners compared to the rest. And here we're getting closer to the Eastern European countries, and you can see there's a big drop in the percentage of high wage earners in the data. And we can basically check whether we find similar patterns in our synthetic data. And I mean, the general pattern, of course, is preserved in all cases, but you can see, especially with the DPMPM, there's some blurring. I mean, it's just smoothing out the distribution to some extent. And
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
What are the categories in the cart? How do you preserve the geography?
So the categories would really be the geocode, so the combined longitudinal, latitudinal geocode, just as one number, basically. So you really have like 10,000 categories.
Is that like an ordinal variable, or how are you treating that?
Categorical, unordered categorical. Because you have a couple of observations that have the same geocode.
So do they correspond to some visible areas in that map and so on? So that you're saying you divide the whole region into 10,000 zones or something?
For the synthesis?
A grid of it.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. So for the synthesis here, we really use the exact geocoding information. And that really means it's really just whatever we have as information. So if I go back to that slide, so exact geocoding information means it's recorded as distance in meters from the point 52 northern latitude, 10 eastern latitude. So that's what you have. It's these two variables, x and y, which just contain these distances. And we just put them together and treat that as a categorical, whatever we get out of there, treat it as a categorical variable for the categorical card approach. And for the continuous one, it's just a continuous variable.
So
because it's a distance to one specific point wherever 52 northern latitude, 10 eastern longitude is. I don't know where that is, but that is just a standard way to record these geocoding information. I don't know there. I forgot the name, what it's called. But this is a typical standard to report your geocoding information as distance to the specific point.
So is it that's your response variable in the regression?
That's the response.
And how many levels does it have then? Like, I mean,
I don't know.
it's a lot, right?
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, as I said, we only do that within 15,000 records. So we split the data,
Okay.
15,000 records. We use the NDAF algorithm for finding clusters of 15,000 records. And then we only run the model within that. But still, it would be a couple of thousand categories.
And CART can handle that.
CART can
Because
handle
often it
that,
has
yeah.
problems kind of, because can you get down to small enough leaves and stuff? I mean, it manages.
Yeah, I mean, CART has problems if your predictor variable has a lot of categories.
Okay,
The
so
outcome
there
variable
is
is less of a problem.
Right.
Because the predictor would have to test all the different combinations of categories. But with the outcome itself, it's not a problem per se.
I mean, on the plot that you showed us, it looked like that did the best. I mean,
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's actually what you can see there. That card categorical would actually work.
So basically, the outcome variable is this geocode, and
Yeah.
then you're trying to predict
Geocode based on
geocode by all
all
of
the
these
other-
categories?
Right.
So a question from Gillian says, are the clusters of 15,000 records defined by geography?
Yeah.
Okay. I hope you heard that.
Yeah.
Gillian.
Yeah. So geography was used as for clustering the data we used.
That's quite surprising that the categorical version, this is why I asked about how you control the variable, the categorical version does better than continuous, because clearly there's geographical correlation.
Yeah, I think the problem that I'm not 100% sure what the reasons are, but I can see if you think that, say, you would have these splits and it would be high wage earners in the 10th age group and in certain conditions, and then you end up in that leaf, right? So this will be the card model the way it was built. And then if you use the continuous card and you do this smoothing there, and you might have points, I mean, they don't need to be necessarily close. So I don't really think treating geocodes as continuous is such a good idea, because, I mean, if you say you end up in the leaf and you have a record here and a record here and a record here that all fulfill these criterion to end up in that leaf, and then you use the continuous synthesizer, you would try to fit a kernel density estimator to these points, and then you generate something somewhere, but that's not necessarily where it should be. I think that is what I think is causing some problems with the card continuous.
The DPMP and the continuous in the sense is that you're building a distribution, you're making random draws. In the categorical, you're just taking you're hot decking. So you're just taking the same value.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same value,
So
definitely.
there's no smoothing going on, there's no random draws, it's just taking out from the empirical, just a random draw basically from the empirical distribution.
Yeah, but I mean, the
So
whole
you get the
point.
real values back,
Yeah,
basically.
that's right. But you're still moving them, right? I mean, it's definitely no longer, because I mean, you still have different values in the leaf, and then you just draw from them, and you just ensure that those. I mean, it's
And
in
when
some
you-
sense
when
you
you
can
take
see
a
it's a
draw like that,
sophisticated
you-
swapping.
Yeah.
It's a sophisticated swapping because
But
you.
do you allow the same person to donate twice or 3 times or 4
Yeah.
times? Or the minute that
Yeah.
you make this decision to hot deck or bootstrap, whatever you want to call it, do you not allow then that donor to contribute the next time,
With
or?
replacement.
Yeah, it is in a sense. It is with replacement, because I mean, whenever you locate a variable in that leaf, you would just start randomly drawing from all the records in that leaf again, and so
So it's with
it could
replacement.
be.
It's not quite swapping, right? Because I mean, you can.
Yeah, it
swap
is.
again.
It is not. I mean, it's not really swapping, but there are. Yeah,
Whatever.
in some sense, there are some relations,
So,
definitely.
just before, I know you probably want to move on, but I just noticed on the cart plots, there's a little island of blue, like halfway up, which don't appear to be in the original data. I was just curious if that.
You mean that
Yeah,
one?
yeah, but in both, is that some? Yeah, it's kind of unusual that you have that kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's no real information around there to, and both. I assume those models were fit independently. Like I don't know.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
true
so-
that it shows up in both. Actually, I didn't look into that more closely, what the issues are there. So there's a small effect that I'm not sure where it comes from. It's a good point. I could try to figure out what's going on there. Say I haven't checked that yet. I mean, just the main story is that clearly card categorical would preserve these patterns that we see in the original data at best. Card continuous comes second, and then there's the DPMPM. And we see that even more clearly here if we look at the share of foreigners in Bavaria. Again, we have these highest rates around Munich, and clearly this looks pretty similar, where here we lose a lot of information, and we also lose quite a lot of information in the card continuous. So based on these measures, we can see that card categorical would come out best. Now for the global measure, we weren't really sure what to look at. what we decided to look at in the end was to compute the relative frequencies of all possible interactions up to 3 ways. So we really took all the variables that we had in our data and looked at the relative frequencies at the zip code level. So say we started with just male, female, what's the percentage in the original data, what's the percentage in the synthetic data? What's the percentage if I look at the cross tabulation of sex times wage category? So that would be a table 20 entries, and so on. So look at all these different possible combinations up to 3-way, and always on the zip code level. So we have a lot of tables to look at. And then we compute the absolute distance of these frequencies between the original data and the synthetic data. And then we just look at the distribution of these distances. We excluded small cell counts of less than 50 cans because if you look at the absolute distance between for the relative frequencies, that would often be there would be very large effects if only 1 or 2 records would change, and we thought that would just would look like there's a lot of problem in the data when there isn't really, basically. So if we look at all these cells that we get, we compare about 1.7 million cells, so that's quite a lot. And then we say as a one number measure, you always want to have this one number that tells you whether the data is good or not, which is compute the sum of all these absolute distances across all the cells. Okay. And this is what I have here. So I guess the titles are too small. So this would be all the one-way interactions, two-way interactions, three-way interactions, and these are the distributions of the differences. Okay. I mean, they should be around 0, hopefully, if you don't want to have it, there's no bias in general. But we can see the DP-NPM is the black one, and that always is has the largest tails of all the distributions. So basically, there's a lot of error and a lot of difference between the original and the synthetic values. And the card continuous comes out somewhere in the middle usually, and card categorical is the best. And if we look at these one number measures where we just sum up all these differences, we can see there's quite a big difference really, because I mean the sum of differences for the DP-NPM is almost 3 times the one for card categorical. So we really lose a lot of information if you want to use that type of measure for your utility evaluations. And in all 3 graphs, it's always the same story. Card categorical comes out best, then card continuous, then the DP-NPM. Okay. Of course, utility is only one side of the medal. We need to look at the risks of those approaches, and we use the risk measures that Jerry and Robin actually proposed in 2009. And I don't want to go through all the formulas for that, but the basic idea is that the intruder has some background knowledge on some target variables and tries to find these target records in the release data to learn some sensitive information that he doesn't know. So the standard record linkage approach that's often used in SDC when you try to evaluate risks.
So can I ask, so would background knowledge include the exact geocode then?
That is, I mean, that's what you would define. I mean, you can decide what you use. We use the exact geocodes.
Well, that seems reasonable, doesn't it?
Yeah, right. Because you could say, I mean,
target person.
knowing you're looking for someone, it's very easy to find out what the geocode would be of that person you're looking for. Exactly.
And in fact, for now, nothing else has been synthesized except for the geocode.
Right. But I mean, you want to make sure that synthesizing the geocode alone is enough, even if the intruder knows age and of course the sex probably and a couple of other things. Okay. And I mean the general idea is the intruder would always declare a record a match wherever he finds the highest matching probability, which makes sense, I guess. And the risk measures would evaluate how often these strategies are successful. And we have 3 risk measures that we want to look at. For them, we need a few definitions first. So we have CJ, which is the number of records declared potential matches for target record J. So it doesn't have to be only one. If they all get the same probability to be a match, there could be more than one declared match in the data. And IJ is an indicator that would tell me whether the true match is among those declared matches. Then I can define my expected match risk. So I'm summing over all my target records, use 1 over CJ, because if there's more than one record, the intruder wouldn't know which one, so he would just pick one of them. So the probability of picking the correct one would be 1 over CJ times IJ. That's my expected match risk. So on expectation, how many records would be correctly identified. Okay. Now we go on and say KJ now is 1 whenever CJ times IJ is 1. So that means there's a unique record identified by the intruder to be the correct match, or to be the match, and this is also the true match. So the intruder only identifies one record and says, I think this is the one, and he's right about that. That's my KJ. So by that, I'll get my true match rate. I sum over those KJs for each of my target records and divide by n, the number of target records I have, or the intruder tries to identify in the data. That's my true match rate. And the fails match rate now, again, a few more definitions. We have Fj now. Fj is Cj times 1 minus Ij. So that just means the intruder thinks there's a single match, declares only one record to be a match, but he's wrong about it. That's my Fj. And so my fails match rate now is summing over those Fjs and dividing it by the number of records where the intruder only identifies one record. So whenever he thinks this record must be the right one, how often is he wrong? That's my fails match rate. Okay. Good. Quality is not really good here. Anyway, so what do we assume? We assume the intruder knows sex, age, the industry of the employer, also the occupation of the individual, whether he's foreign or not, and the geocode. Because these are all variables where you could argue if there's a specific person he has in mind and try to identify, he would usually know these categories. For the target records, we simply sampled 100 records from each of the clusters. And since we had 222 clusters, we end up with 20,200 target records that we use and see how many of those would the intruder successfully identify. And then we assume that the intruder uses different strategies when he matches on the geocode. So he will use different grids for matching on the geocode because he knows the geocode has been synthesized. So he would try either really using a match on the exact geocode, or he would declare a match whenever his geocode that he has is within a, well, no, the synthetic geocode is within a 100 times 100 square meter grid around the geocode that he used, that he knows, or if it's within a 1,000 square meter grid. So he basically just avoids trying to use too much information on the geocode because he knows there has been some synthesis going on in that variable. Okay. And so here are the results. And again, not surprising, it's just the opposite of what you get from the utility, which is probably basically almost the case. So with card categorical, you get quite high rates. Card continuous, somewhere in the middle, and the DPM-PM is lower, although we can see the difference between card and DPM-PM is really not that much. So there's a little increase here. So in general, I could probably say forget about the DPM-PM. It loses on all dimensions. Dimensions against the other
just
ones.
a quick clarification. Are those,
Yeah.
so these are just the true numbers, right? So these are like, out of 22,200, about 17 were identified.
Yeah, sorry, that is not really written very clearly. So the expected, and so these are really the numbers. So how many records would you expect to be correctly identified? Whereas these are rates, so 17%.
70%.
So this will be percentage. True rate, fails rate, these are all in percent.
So does one of your grids correspond to the categories using CART?
With card again, so we use the exact geocode, so not any grids at this stage. This will be later. We use any predefined grids before, so they don't. So it would be the exact if you want to look at the correspondence. So
The grid thing doesn't make any sense for the categorical cards, because the intruder, assuming the intruder knows, the intruder vaguely knows something that this data is a bit weird, but doesn't actually know how it's been generated. But if the intruder knows how the data's been generated, then using a aggregation doesn't make any sense.
I guess the argument would be, what would happen if you really have clusters in so geographical clusters of specific individuals with specific features, and then I mean you put all of them in the same leaf, and then you synthesize, and then they are still close. That might be one motivation. So if you think that they won't jump around all over the place, those ones that the ones you pick in the leaf, they might still be in the same area, which in some sense could make sense if you think of these. I mean, there's clearly some geographical relationship between the geocode and certain variables, which is exactly what you want to preserve. So in that sense, there might be reason that those records would end up, those in the same leaf would also be geographically closer.
But in practice, the results bear out my assertion anyway, because the continuous, you're improving the rate, and for the categorical, it's getting worse.
Yeah, right. So I mean, that is basically what I also wanted to point out. You can see that with these two, this strategy of the intruder would really actually make sense. So he would improve on his successful identification rates, basically, quite a lot until he gets to that level. Then you see some decrease for the DPM, DPMPM just keeps improving, which basically says, and this is something I'll come to. So what I have here is the expected risks that you would get if you would not use the geocodes at all, which is like a benchmark, because so he would only match on sex, age, industry, occupation, and employer. So only those that are not synthesized. And so you can see that as a benchmark in two ways. First of all, this is what is already available for users at the IAB. So in that sense, you can see if you find that kind of risk, I mean, I should say there's only a 2% sample of the data available to users. But if you find for the full data that this is my benchmark, I could say when I get with my synthetic data with additional geocodes in it to the same risk levels that are already acceptable for the IAB, then you can say that I could probably release these synthetic geocodes. So that's basically the argument. And for the DPMPM, you can just see, I mean, they would always be lower, so the intruder would always be better off not to use the geocodes at all in his re-identification strategy, because they only make the results or the success rate go down, just because they are changed so much.
Sorry, the true rate in the categorical CART, that's almost the same as the expected rate then. I mean, in terms of absolute numbers, because 17.33%.
Yeah, which makes sense if you get that for the exact matching, and you usually only have, I mean, sometimes you have more than 2 data points with the same geocodes, but
it's either going to be right or wrong, basically. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, you can say in some sense that this would be the benchmark to aim for, and those two would basically more or less fulfill that already. You're a little bit above here for the CART continuous, but you can argue that the intruder would never know which would be the optimal aggregation that he should use when he tries to identify records in the data. But for the card, we are obviously quite a bit above that. So it's much higher the risk. And you can say, yeah, well, that's maybe still too much, and I still need to do something about my geocodes if I really want to protect my data sufficiently. And this is where we come to the second part of our evaluation. We said, what could we do if we feel that synthesizing geocodes alone is not sufficient? And as I said in the beginning, there would be a couple of strategies. Actually, I have a few more here. You could say, I could basically say, I'm fine with these other synthesizers. I could use one of them, then I have low utility, low risk. I could also increase the complexity parameter of the card model, and I didn't talk about that before. So with card, you can define, there's a complexity parameter that basically says when to stop growing the tree. And that is basically based on how much improvement in terms of homogeneity you want to have if you want another split. So if you feel that this additional split doesn't bring much additional improvement in terms of how homogeneous my different leaves are, then just don't split it. That's basically just one strategy to avoid overfitting your card models. And the general strategy with the synthetic data is usually to use a very low level for these complexity parameters, just to make sure you grow really large trees. So that would be another option to, depending on how you define that complexity parameter, either increase or decreases. So basically punish the tree more so that you grow smaller trees. But of course, that would mean you lose some utility again. And the final approach that we are looking at is just using other methods, as I said in the beginning, either aggregate the geographic information or synthesize more variables. We're running out of time. And we only focus on the categorical card here because we already saw the other ones have more or less acceptable risk. So the first approach that I said, the classical approach, is just to aggregate data before synthesis. So we aggregate the exact geocodes to 10 meter grids, 10 square meter grids, 100 square meter grids, or 1,000 square meter grids, and then just do the synthesis after that. So just synthesizing these grid points now instead of the exact geocode. Okay? And we expect two effects on disclosure risk. There's a higher level of protection because less information is available for matching, obviously, because you only have that aggregate information. But there might also be some increase in risk because your synthesis model might become better. Just because you have less categories, models might be more successful in preserving the distribution of those categories. The effects on utility, obviously, if you want very detailed levels for your analysis, you cannot use the data anymore. And even if you have aggregated levels, the boundaries you're interested in might not necessarily coincide with the boundaries that you get from this aggregated data. So clearly, there's a price to pay for that. And here are the results for aggregation. Again, we look at we use the same utility measures that we used before. And we assume that the analyst would use the zip code, which is closest to the released geocode, which probably makes sense. And here we only present the level of aggregation for the risk analysis that caused the highest risk. So just to look at that, and we can see these were the results that we had before for card categorical. And now we can see what happens if we use 10 times 10 square meter grids, 100 times 100 square meter grids, and so on. And we can actually see the data utility, and you have to think of data utility as the inverse. Reducing the number means higher data utility because we are summing the deviations, right? And so you can see that we can actually improve on data utility if we use more aggregated grid sizes. But of course, the price then is that our risk goes further up, which obviously wasn't the goal of this whole game. We wanted to reduce the risks. So in that sense, aggregating the data wouldn't help at all in terms of protecting the data more. So in that sense, that's definitely not a strategy that agencies should follow. So then we only have the other alternative of synthesizing more variables. And what we did here is we successively increased the number of synthesized variables. So we started with synthesizing age in addition to the geocode, then occupation, then we added foreign status, and then we had a final model where we synthesized all variables except for sex and age. And the results, which is like this. So again, the results that we had in our original setting where we only synthesized geocodes. And once we synthesized age, we can see the utility drops a little bit, but the risks, of course, go down significantly. So that's really a big step here. And the data is much better protected, which is probably not that surprising if more synthetic variables are in the data. That improves the protection a lot. And the further you go down here, I mean, here you basically have more or less no risk anymore. The true rate is 0.04%, and the fails rate is close to 100. So it would always be wrong, basically, whenever the intruder declares a match. And just for comparison, the data utility for card continuous and DPNPM using the exact geocodes was already 974. So these numbers are already larger than the numbers we get when we synthesize all those variables with the card continuous. So card continuous is card categorical. So card categorical is obviously a lot better in preserving the information in the data than any of the other models. And it's also important to note that once we synthesize geocode and age, we already get to these 1,800 numbers that we had before, which seemed to be acceptable for a release strategy, or I shouldn't say release strategy because the data is only available on site at the IB, so you cannot take it out. But we could say, given that this was acceptable or is acceptable at the IB, we could say, okay, then we could synthesize age and geocode and provide a 2% sample, because that's what's available right now at the IB, a 2% sample of the data, including the synthetic geocode and synthetic age, to the users, and we would get the same kind of risk. Okay? So my conclusions, in terms of analytical validity, all methods smooth this geospatial effects to some extent, and especially the DPNPM. Card categorical performs best, and another point that I didn't really mention before is another disadvantage of the card continuous is that you can generate unreasonable geocodes, because I mean, if you treat it as continuous, you can generate geocodes of individuals living in the middle of a lake, living in a purely industrial area, living in the forest, or something like that. So you will easily generate geocodes that just don't make any sense at all. And this cannot happen with the card categorical. So that's another improvement in terms of utility for the card categorical. And not surprisingly, the risks are inversely related to analytical validity. And if the risks for the card categorical are deemed too high, then this aggregating approach is definitely not recommended. Instead, synthesizing more variables would be the strategy. And future plans will be to deal with place of living, place of work relationships. So if you really want to preserve commuting patterns, things get a lot more complex. This is much more multidimensional and much harder to protect and still get good utility. So I'm not sure how you could treat that, but interesting question for the future. Okay, that's it. Questions, comments?
Got several from Gillian, but I don't know if you want to do those.
Meanwhile, maybe we can set up the
Yeah,
other
maybe,
time,
do you want
because
to
we're
set
going
up
to
the-
really get kicked out of here.
Is that really okay? Yeah, we probably need to keep time.
Okay, yeah,
What do we
yeah,
want to
so-
do? Do we want to?
Do you want to set up for now the
Yeah, do you
other
wanna
talk, and then
put
we
your-
can
do you wanna
address a
come
few
up and-
questions?
Should I just start with one that Gillian said? First relates to utility. When comparing frequencies across cells, did you just use raw counts or proportions or something else? There is a link between one of these measures and propensity score measure of difference, as I presented in a seminar during the Synthetic Data Week at the beginning of November, and the non-distributions can be derived.
so what we looked at is we looked at the relative frequencies. So say, as I said, it's the simple example, 51% male, 49% female in the original data, and 52% male and 49% female, and 48% female in the synthetic data. Then the difference, the absolute difference now would be this 1 percentage point for these cells. So that's the risk, the utility measure just for this one cell, and you can think of that for all these different combinations and interactions of the variables. So I'm not sure if this is directly related to the propensity score method. Isn't that for you? Yeah. Yeah, other questions?
So you're treating each of the cell counts as exactly equivalent, you know, so the margins are the same as the three-way interactions, because you're just adding up the differences.
Right.
Yeah, it's questionable whether that's reasonable, but I mean,
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, obviously, once you get to the more details, so the three-way interactions, all those percentages will be small numbers, right? So in that sense, you don't get much difference on the absolute scale, and I don't know. I'm really happy to take suggestions for a better way to measure these differences and on the different interactions. Because I mean, if you look at the absolute values, then you have other issues and so where you have small counts, and then these differences look small, but they are really big in terms of changing the relative frequencies.
I guess the other sort of side of the coin is the so with your overall risk measure, you're not considering the distribution of risk at all, and that might be affected differently by the different techniques.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the good thing about these risk measures is that they are still computed on the individual level. So the final measures are aggregates of these individual risks. So it would be a good idea to then maybe look at, I don't know, certain individuals more specifically with certain characteristics. Maybe is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's just simulating an intruder who has auxiliary information about the sort of underlying distributions and can make some estimate saying that's probably not a real match, that's highly likely to be a real match. So it's a more sophisticated intruder. And that the shape of that will be affected by your synthetic data generating mechanism. How? Well, it could be. It could be. That's an empirical question, but it could be.
Yeah. No, that's an idea to look at that more. Specific subgroups.
Okay, I think we should probably definitely move on because we are sort of overrunning. So Gillian, I'm sorry I couldn't put your other questions forward to Joerg. But
You can email them.
Yeah,
to me.
I'll forward them to Joerg, and then maybe you can communicate like that, if that's okay. Okay, so we should press on. Hopefully people are still with us, listening remotely. So our second seminar of the day is given by Atiku, and he's going to be presenting a risk-utility balancing approach to generate synthetic microdata.
Good evening. I am not an expert of synthetic data. Experts are sitting in front of me. I'm here to share my problems when I started to generate some synthetic data to mask a data matrix that came from smart grid, smart city data. But I encountered the problem when I was trying to mask the data matrix. The problem was the computation of risk and the utility. So it is really very hard to convince from where I start and which set of data I should release after synthetic data generation. So to generate the synthetic data, the first thing is what is synthetic data? The definition is, I'm not going to provide the definition. The thing is that anything, the original data, if we change the original data or alter the original data, that can be synthetic data. That sort of concept has been used in many literatures in early 60s, in some engineering literatures, even in some biological sciences. But in terms of statistical disclosure control, so we think that there should be some model. The data that we are going to generate to mask the original data matrix, it should be based on some statistical models. And the data that we are going to generate based on some statistical model would at least hold two properties. The first one is the generated data should reduce the chance